Fantastic. And now I'd like to welcome our panelists to come to the stage to talk about the middle class squeeze and the effects of income inequality.
So I think that video really laid out our challenges. So I'm going to really get right into it because we have a fantastic panel. I'll just do a brief introduction of these folks who almost need no introduction. Really honored to have Senator Tammy Baldwin here of Wisconsin, who's on the Budget Committee. He's been a strong advocate for progressive causes, but also for economic fairness. So we're really honored to have you here. We have Nick Hanauer, an entrepreneur and venture capitalist, an original investor in Amazon, and I think a person who has brought more to the debate on middle-out economics than perhaps anyone else here. So, and we also have Lee Saunders, president of AFSCME, who has been focused particularly on how to ensure that people in the middle class are staying there, how collective bargaining is part of that. And finally, last but not least, Gene Sperling, former director of the National Economic Council under both President Clinton and President Obama. I should say one of CAP's original senior fellows. That's really critical. And has done a tremendous amount of work on a whole slew of issues, particularly on moving people from poverty into the middle class. So I'm looking forward to a really good discussion this morning, and we will actually try and get a lot of questions in from the audience. So, but I'll start it off here. We heard in the video, essentially, the challenge of our time, which is the struggles of people in the middle class today. CAP did a report recently on, kind of how the economy is really working for a prototypical middle class family, and we found that from 2000 to 2012, wages have really stood still for that sort of prototypical family, two parents working, two children, but costs have gone up. Healthcare costs have gone up, education costs, higher education costs, retirement costs, and so there's a real squeeze in the middle, and we try to frame that and make try to get people to understand that people have less disposable income today, which means they're consuming less, they're buying less. That's one of the challenges we face in our economy. So I'm hopeful we'll get to some new analysis, but real solutions. And so I'm going to start off with you, Gene. Maybe as from your vantage point, having worked on economic policy at the White House, what you see of where the economy is today and perhaps some ideas to move us forward.
Well, I think you're right to talk about this as the challenge of our times. And the way I would put it is we are going through a dramatic period of globalization, technological advancement, maybe unprecedented. And I think the fundamental challenge is that going to hollow out the middle class or strengthen the middle class? And I think that is in many ways, the great challenge of our times. And if you look across the world, even though you might see some broad global inequality closing in the sense that there's perhaps less poverty in China, India, et cetera, within countries, you see this challenge virtually everywhere. And so I think that you can't pretend you can stop that change, but I think we have an obligation to try to shape that change. And I think we have to think about it in a few different ways. I think one, we have to kind of think about what are the building blocks of being a middle class family. And I think, middle class to me, I don't think is as much a particular income as I think what you're referring to, Neera, which is, do you feel that you can provide for your family the degree of dignity, security, opportunity? And in a lot of those areas, even with all the change in the world, we do have the power to do things more on healthcare costs, or that's a great advancement of the ACA, that no longer does somebody worry that a single pink slip is going to bankrupt their family for losing healthcare. I think that I think secondly, you heard Mayor talking about, the Secretary talking about college opportunity. College opportunity is a twofer. It both is a middle class squeeze issue, but it's also the opportunity you need to kind of advance. So And then, I'll talk, maybe when we come back, talk a little bit more about my views on retirement securities. But the point is that those are things we can deal with in policy, even with the degree of change. And I think the harder issue is really having a different kind of supply side economics, not the supply side where you have a huge amount of capital and you hope it trickles down, but I think a supply of the public investments that are critical to the United States being a magnet for high-wage job creation. And that supply is a supply of modern infrastructure. That supply is a supply of skilled and flexible workers who can move from job to job. That's a supply of ensuring that we've got low energy costs, that clusters were an attractive place to locate. And I think those are, those are the critical issues. And I think, finally, as you said, also within our control is to make sure, I think it was the line that President Clinton started, and I think President Obama's continued, we can make sure through our policies, through things like minimum wage and the earned income tax credit, that cannot help us deal with the middle class squeeze. It can make us say as a country that nobody who works full time should have to raise their children with poverty. So we have a lot of capacity to do that. Economically, we did see 5 or 6 years in the 90s where productivity gains did go broadly. And you saw, if you look back now at today's dollars, you basically saw the average family go up $10,000. African-American families, $11,000. So we have seen this little oasis. I'd love to say it was just all because the Clinton administration was there and we were there. But obviously the world's become more complicated, it's more threat. But it is interesting to note that in this period, there was a period where we did find a way to ensure that productivity gains were broader. It's much more difficult now. The pace of globalization technology is greater, but I also don't think we should get lost in impossibility. It's not impossible. We've seen it, and there's no reason we can't try to return to that.
Great. Nick, you recently wrote a piece in Politico about overtime, but I hope you can kind of give us your frame on what's really happening in the economy and why we should go to solutions like overtime.
Well, I think that the most pernicious thing about trickle-down economics and the policy framework that it represents isn't the idea that if the rich get richer, that's good for the economy, which is, sort of imbues our policy and our culture, but is equally that if the poor get richer, that will be bad for the economy. And that idea that if the poor get richer, it will be bad for the economy, I think informs a huge amount of our politics and policy and makes progressives makes progressives the corporate stooges that most voters believe that we are. How do they know we're corporate stooges? Because we advocate officially for things like the $9 minimum wage, not a $15 minimum wage. That's the difference between being a corporate stooge and not being a corporate stooge. And as you may have noticed, $9 went nowhere, but 15 turned into a mean and has begun to change lives. It's this intuition that if we go too far, it will be bad for the economy that is the biggest enemy, both of the American people, but in my opinion, the Democratic Party. And I use the overtime thing as a great example. You may not know, but the president has the authority to change the overtime rules. Currently, 11% of salaried workers are entitled to overtime, but at the peak, it was 65%. And I wrote a piece yesterday arguing that he should raise it to the former level, which would be $69,000, which would include 10 or 11 million more Americans. Of course, most Americans are exempt from overtime because of the relentless efforts of lobbyists to say, well, this person doesn't deserve it and that person doesn't deserve it, and so on and so forth. And how you know we're feckless corporate stooges is that people aren't up in arms over this very, very important issue. Right? Like, here's something that we could pick a fight over. Here's something we could stand for. Here's the way for us to make an actual difference in the lives of middle-class people. And what the Obama administration is almost certainly going to do is go half as far as you'd like and then back a little bit because the Chamber of Commerce is going to be mad at them, instead of going all the way. And so I think that, what we have to do is realize that we've been wrong, and that, frankly, when workers have more money, businesses have more customers and need more workers. And the farther we go, the better it will get, both for the American people, our economy, and our party.
I haven't seen the Chamber of Commerce really jumping on anything the Obama, positively on anything the Obama administration has done. So I'm not sure that would be like an incentive structure for them. But we'll come back a little bit to overtime. So Lee, I think what's been one of the most fascinating aspects of the conversation we've been having over the last couple of years, we have been able to get people to understand, I think, this kind of argument that both Jean and Nick have made, which is that a growing middle class is actually really good for the economy and economic growth. Inequality is now, more and more people see inequality as a bad thing for economic growth. But I think we still have a challenge with wages are stagnant. There's not a lot of pressure upward on wages. We're all seeing that as a problem. But some of the institutions that help create upward pressure on wages, collective bargaining unions, still are heavily maligned by the right. Do you have ideas for us on how we can make that argument more clearly, what we should be doing on collective bargaining? Because it does seem to me, if you look at other countries, having higher unionization rates has created upward pressure on wages at a time when it hasn't happened in the U.S.
Well, I think I'm going to sound like a broken record this morning. The way that you grow the middle class and to strengthen the middle class is to grow the labor movement and have a strong labor movement in this country. There is a direct correlation between the decline of organization of workers in this country and the decline of the middle class. Right now, workers are organized on average 11% across the country. In the private sector, it's down to 6.5%. In the public sector, it's about 35%. That's why we have a bullseye on our back right now in the public sector unions, where rights are being stolen from us. Collective bargaining rights are being taken away in state after state after state. I travel all over the country, and I sit down and we talk with members, talk with the problems that confront them every single day. I was talking to a woman in the state of Wisconsin, Tammy. Her name is Leah Lipsky. She doesn't consider herself to be in the middle class, that she's working hard every single day in a full-time job, full-time state job. She had to get a second job, not to have more money in her pocket to do different kinds of things, but she had to get a second job to survive, to put food on the table, to provide education for her kids. We're a better country than that. We've got to have strong collective bargaining rights rather than taking collective bargaining away from workers, which is happening. We've got to move a higher minimum wage, although that is just one step. That is not the only answer, but workers need a voice, a collective voice in this country. And unfortunately, instead of trying to gain a collective voice and provide the ability for workers to sit at the table, you have individuals that are trying to take that power away from them, take the collective bargaining power away from them. And that's just wrong. And if you do that, and if you're successful in doing that, then the middle class will never be strong in this country.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Lee. Senator Baldwin, it's interesting. We had an election just a couple of weeks ago. People, if you look at exit polls, people are really concerned about economic growth, how they're doing. Not economic growth writ large, but really how they're still anxious, still worried, still think the playing field isn't very level. How do you, at the same time in Washington, we're not really talking about so many of the issues Jean laid out, higher costs across the board. Our budget debate has really become about austerity versus overspending. As a member of the Budget Committee, what do you see we should be doing, and how can we actually get Congress to address some of these challenges?
Well, let me start with the points you were making about the election and the exit polls and the connections, because I think one of the most important things for people in Washington is to really listen and to engage. And if you hear the struggles, you can't help but come back here with a different fight in your belly than otherwise. And I don't know that the problem was what we stood for. It was more of a disconnect in who we were fighting for. If we look at many of these issues we've championed and looked at them more as movements, engaging people along the way, I think we would have had a different outcome. But before I get more deeply into that, on the Budget Committee, you're absolutely right. The incoming Republican majority is going to likely talk about deficits. That's been a theme for a number of years. There are some other non-monetary deficits that we need to be prioritizing, that we need to be focusing on. The US now has an education deficit. The US has an infrastructure deficit. The US has an innovation deficit. And these deficits are extremely burdensome on the middle class and those trying to aspire to the middle class. And if we let that fiscal deficit dominate the discussion, we're not going to make progress on the things, the real tools that people need to get ahead and that our economy needs to start moving again. And so I hope that that will be one of the core debates as we initiate our activities on the budget for next year. But it can't just be a debate in that room or those rooms, the House and the Senate. Again, it really has to engage people in a way that wasn't achieved in this past election.
Regine, I'd love you to follow up on that. I also think we have, as we've described, we sort of have a wage challenge and a cost challenge. Retirement costs are part of that. So love for you to respond to Senator Baldwin and then any additional thoughts on solutions.
I think we have to understand we're talking economic policy. You know, we get lost in particular metrics on the deficit, et cetera. Your goal, you know, any metric regarding the deficit is not an end in itself. It's a means. It's a means to a broader goal of a stronger economy that helps people live with dignity and security. So what happens is that people get stuck on a metric and it becomes separated from what's actually good economic policy. Smart fiscal policy means having to do three things right at the same time. It does mean that you have to give confidence that your country is not going to have a debt crisis in the future. That's important for making people decide to do long-term investment on your shores. So that is a worthy goal. But that has to be done at the same time with smart macroeconomic policy. Secondly, that means that you are increasing demand when you need to be increasing demand. When you are coming back from the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, when you know that a recovery after a financial crisis is going to be less robust because people are deleveraging instead of spending, that is when you need stronger demand. You can have stronger demand in the short term to help get the economy going and labor markets tight and still take policies that give people long-term confidence. And then the third, which is what the senator was saying, is what do you cut? Do you cut the things that are important for investment, for strengthening the middle class? And the deficit is improving, but the whole strategy is a little backwards because we haven't really done that much to give people more confidence in our long term. On the other hand, in the short term, we've gone through the worst crisis, and you know, this recovery would have been closer to 3.5% or 4% if we had not had contraction at the state and local level. We, you know, we were losing jobs, and you know, it just made no sense at all after the worst financial crisis. So people have to be able to talk about more. They have to talk about deficit and budgets as an economic strategy. So it can make a lot of sense in one budget to both deal with your long-term fiscal situation, to actually expand more demand in the short term, and secondly, to invest in the things that make sense. Now, when you can do the second and third together at the same time, that's a sweet spot. So you could deal with our long-term fiscal challenge. At the same time, you could be doing more to say everything that is a deferred maintenance problem, from school construction to buildings, everything you have to do there, let's do now. We have to do it anyways, let's do it now, because a tighter labor market is still one of the best things we can ever do. I mean, what was so beautiful at the end of the 90s was the labor market was so tight, people had to pay more. So I think it's very, very important that we have a better you know, I don't even think we should talk about deficit reduction. You should only talk about what your economic strategy is. And deficit reduction only makes sense if it's organized correctly within a strategy that also looks about when you want to expand demand and what are the investments in the future. And it's only if you get all three of those right that it makes sense. And right now, the failure of the Republican Congress to take seriously having more infrastructure, et cetera, the failure of Germany and Europe to support demand is significantly hurting the global economy now, puts at risk in Europe a second recession or deflation. And in the United States right now, it means that even as unemployment's coming down, we still do not have the kind of tightness that makes more employers have to give people a raise, which is much at the heart of what we're talking about.
So could I just follow up with one thing? You know, there's a lot of discussion of Thomas Piketty's analysis of how much inequality there is. Our tax code, if you look at other countries versus the United States, one of the reasons why we have the levels of inequality we have is because of a different kind of tax code than other countries. One of the areas in which that, you know, people don't really focus on, but that exacerbates inequality instead of reducing it, is a lot of our retirement policies. You know, we are trying to think through what are real solutions to addressing inequality and the challenges people are facing with high costs.
Right.
So is there something in the retirement space that we should be looking at?
Let me say something, which is Thomas Piketty deserves an enormous amount of credit for raising the issue of inequality. The thing that we can't do, though, is at the end of his book, he kind of says, well, geez, this is just like an inevitable process, and we have to have like a, you know, utopian global redistribution tax. And if there's one thing CAP should represent, is the idea that no, there's actually very tangible policies we can do right now. So I'm going to leave you with a statistic or two that should just really get to you. The only reason that you have tax incentives for retirement savings is that you believe people will be myopic. They won't save enough for their future. So you want to incent them to save more. So if you even start at what the entire purpose is for any tax incentive for savings, the only thing that justifies it is incentives for people who might not save enough without the incentive, okay? The top 5% of our country gets more tax cuts for savings than the bottom 80% combined. That's worth thinking about a little. That's not just income. I mean, you know, it's hard to control income and wealth. That's our policies. That's our tax policies. That is an upside down policy. That is actually giving more savings to people who need it the less, and less to people, and virtually nothing to people who need it the most. The reality is that most of the people in this room right now probably have a 401k. We're all triple winners. Most of us have an employer 401k. Great. Our employer actually gives us a match for our savings. Terrific. And because a lot of us are in a higher bracket, we get to deduct 25, 28, 39% from our savings. The people who will likely clean up this room are triple losers in our system. They probably do not have any employer-provided 401k. They probably do not have a match, or overwhelmingly, 3% of people making under $30,000 get a matching incentive from their employer. And what's their tax incentive for doing it? If they're in the 10% bracket, 10%. We have a completely upside-down system. And I'll stop with this because I know I've answered 2 questions in a row. But the important thing to really think about this is it's not just a cost issue. Piketty's talking about the fact that wages may not keep up with the growth of capital and savings. Well, we should try to increase wages, but we should also try to help more working people be part of then the savings and capital side. So when we do retirement, when we give more money there, we need a dignified retirement. We take more pressure off them so they can use more of their money to spend. But if it does turn out that you're getting higher returns from the market and capital, we're letting more average, typical working families be part of that growth. It's one of the most important things that we should be doing for a progressive middle class agenda, is right-sizing the upside-down tax system for retirement savings.
So I think, Nick, I wanted to turn to you because I think Jean is pointing out kind of an example we live with in policy all the time. It's an example of how our tax policy actually leans the counter way that it should, right? Instead of expanding opportunity for all people to become well, to become wealthier and wealthier. It's actually a system that helps the wealthy and doesn't really help other people. So I'd love for you to, I know that we've talked a lot about middle-out economics, but I think it'd be helpful for people to understand, how do we get to that system, right, where people think that the thing to do is to sort of incentivize the top and I'll sprinkle down?
Yeah, well, I think it starts just by acknowledging that that's been the way in which we've conceptualized growth, right? For a generation, people have, on both the right and left, have sort of accepted this idea that the richer the rich get, the better off we'll all be, and our policies all reflect that. And if you just zoom out to the macro economy, you can see it playing out. So throughout most of this century, corporate profits were at about a 6% of GDP, and then in the late 70s, early 80s, they started to climb. Today, they're 12, 13% of GDP. At the same time, wages fell as a percent of GDP from about 52, 53 to 46. Mm-hmm. So what happened is $1 trillion, as a consequence of the demise of unions and 1,000 other things, $1 trillion. That's basically what 6% of GDP is, went from workers to owners. And what few Americans seem to realize is that $1 trillion in profit isn't profit because it needs to be or should be or has to be. It's profit because people like me, powerful people, prefer it to be. That profit could be used as wages, it could be used as discounts for consumers. And what we need to do is see what's happened. I think it's so important for people to see what's happened and realize that, okay, so not only have people like me earn profits, you'd say, well, maybe it'll be good for the country, right? We'll invest it back. Not true. What do? We do stock buybacks, right? So over the last 10 years, the 10,000 or so public companies in the United States of America have devoted over half of those extra profits to stock buybacks. That's when we buy our own stock back to jack the stock price. It's $6.9 trillion over the last 10 years. $6.9 trillion has been used by people like me to jack stock prices. That explains everything, I think, in my opinion, which is wrong for America. The entire infrastructure deficit is $3.6 trillion. Student debt crisis is $1.2 trillion. I mean, if we don't have the courage to see what's happened to the economy and the way in which that process isn't just happening, it's actually accelerating, and deal with it in some sort of substantive ways, all the messing around at the edges in the world isn't gonna do a difference. And I think that what people have to recognize, I mean, we have to recognize that's what's happening, and we have to offer, as progressives, an alternative theory of growth, something which is affirmative, persuasive, intuitive, and so on and so forth. And that is largely that a thriving middle class isn't a consequence of growth, it's not an effect of growth, it is actually the cause of growth in technological capitalist societies. And if we litigate it that way, in my opinion, we can turn this stuff all around.
Great. So Lee, I'd love to talk a little bit about how your members are really seeing this. But I guess, I think we talk a lot about inequality as too many at the top, too many at the bottom. I think one of the ways we see this as a policy matter is really building off of what Nick said, which is we're just getting too few in the middle. And actually, if you look at how countries grow over history, it's having a larger and larger and larger middle that has allowed people to really thrive, and not just our country, but countries around the world. So, so it's not to decry the many at the top; it's to really try to expand the middle. But I think people lose sight of how people are experiencing this, and so it'd be great for us to understand how your members, how working people in state after state, how are they experiencing the economy, and what are ideas that you have, absolutely in collective bargaining, but other ideas to bring to the table to actually focus on their needs?
Well, I think the key to economic growth is to create jobs and create quality jobs, not just low-paying jobs, but to create quality jobs. And you don't have that in this country right now. You have a lot of people that are suffering. One of the ways in which you can create quality jobs is to invest in our infrastructure all across the country. That creates quality jobs in state and local governments and in the private sector. you know, our folks are suffering. Working people are suffering. They don't have the disposable income where they can put money into a 401k program, yet retirement security is at risk for everyone. Now, maybe most folks have a 401k in this room. I've got a defined benefit, and I think that's a much better program and a much more solid program for working families across this country. And we shouldn't just sweep that away and look at a 401k as the end all or the solution to the problem. Retirement security is being attacked like never before. Gene is aware of this. We worked on the city of Detroit bankruptcy together, where the average AFSCME pensioner, the retiree, was receiving $19,000 a year in benefits after working 30 and 35 years in city service. $19,000 a year. Yet when that bankruptcy started, they were talking about cutting that benefit by 40%. That's just not fair, and it's not right. And that's not the key to the problem. The problem is not the retirement benefit. The problem is that you've got a tax base that is eroded across this country in urban areas where you've had major corporations that have moved out, that have moved overseas, and that tax base is eroding. And we've got to figure out ways collectively together to develop an urban policy where we have a new tax base in those urban areas, which are the engines for growth across this country.
That's great, thanks. We're gonna go to questions in the audience, and we have folks with mics. I'll have one last question for you, Senator Baldwin. We've done a lot of work at CAP on women's economic security. If you think about one of the ways the United States is also very different from other countries, it is that we don't have a slew of workplace policies that other countries have. So families, fathers and mothers, have to face some pretty tough choices about work when they have children. So 70% of low-income workers don't have a single sick day, access to a paid sick day. Very few workers actually have paid leave proposals. And the connection we make to economic growth is that actually we want to have higher and higher participation of women in the workforce as a key strategy for economic growth over the long term. What are your thoughts? These are debates that people are having in their kitchen tables. Paid sick days, when it's on the ballot, has actually won. But it's so divorced from the conversation we're having in Washington. What are your thoughts on how we move that debate or what we should be actually focusing on?
Well, and critical debates to have, and you just noted that there aren't that many national policies relating to the workforce in this regard, but those that exist, many of which have been undermined by the Supreme Court in rulings recently, and I'll touch on a couple of those. But you know, I think about the fact that we're one of the few industrialized countries that doesn't have paid family leave after the birth of a child, that if you're talking about a single mom, I think the average is 40% of her take-home pay goes to child care. We have sort of lifespan issues that we're talking about. You were mentioning earlier that a disproportionate number of minimum wage workers are women. If we looked at the tipped wage, which is shockingly low in this country, $2.13 an hour, a hugely disproportionate number of those workers are women. And I want to sort of add to that, that if they are dependent on those who will tip to make up the difference of that tipped wage and what they will ultimately take home, there are no workplace protections in their relationship with the person who's going to give the tip and the worker, which is a real issue in many settings across the country. I'd say a couple of other things just to sort of tease people with some ideas here. We recall the Supreme Court striking down one of the ways in which you try to enforce equal pay for equal work laws, and then the congressional response was Lilly Ledbetter. But we also know that that has real limitations in terms of evening the playing field. We followed suit with a Paycheck Protection Act, But I think we need to revisit another concept that's, I think, really important. Is you'll notice still in many workplaces, private sector and public sector, that we still have very segregated job classifications, where there's all women who do one thing, all men who do another thing. And so there'll be equal pay for equal work with the person beside you, but we're not necessarily making the appropriate comparisons between what we're asking those groups of workers to do. And I think we need to re-enliven a discussion about comparable worth policy at the same time that we're talking about strengthening equal pay for equal work. I want to mention another case that was decided last session by the Supreme Court, Vance. This deals with harassment in the workforce. And their conclusion was that the employer would not be liable for supervisor harassment if that supervisor did not have hiring and firing authority over the employee. Well, how many settings is that? It's many. They might decide all conditions of work except for hiring and firing. But if there's not those tools to be able to enforce basic harassment laws, we have seen a huge erosion, and we need to overturn that, and that's something that I would hope there wouldn't be a ton of partisanship around. And then lastly, because women are disproportionately impacted by receive lower wages, et cetera, over a lifetime, that impacts retirement security. And so we all probably know folks that are reliant in their retirement solely on Social Security, which represents a mere fraction of what they earn during their working life. We need to look at tax strategies, poverty reduction tax strategies, similar to the Earned Income Tax Credit, that relate to retirement and lifting somebody on that Social Security only income up to and above poverty.
Those are great ideas. Are there questions in the audience? Great, right in here. If you could just identify yourself.
Hi, can I be heard? Okay, Vina Trahan. I would identify myself primarily as a writer and activist. I also help run a foundation. But two different questions. One is on financial reform. There was a New York Times article, I don't know when, assuming that saying that it sucked between $6 and $36 trillion out of the economy. The financial crisis did, and we know it aggravated both wealth inequalities among the general public and minorities in particular. So my first question is, what do we do here? Do we pass Glass-Steagall? Are there other steps that we should take to avoid a financial crisis? Second issue is over boycotting. We know there are a lot of corporations that do all kinds of crazy things when it comes to tax havens. They might pay their CEOs more than they do in federal taxes. They're huge takers of corporate welfare. They give money to Republicans. And I know everybody is allergic to the word boycott, but I would say you could also see it as buying things that reflect your basic humanity and values. So those two subjects, I know they're not
Great.
strictly.
I'll ask at least the first one. I mean, we are 501c3. I need to explain. So I'm not going to say boycott things Republican. So, Jean, on the first issue of the Great Recession and how much wealth it really evaporated, just to be frank, evaporated and really hit hardest communities of color. African American, Latino wealth was hit really sharply. And are there additional steps we should take given what happened? And
Sure.
maybe I'll ask Nick to join in as well.
Well, there's no question. The harm created by the financial crisis is enormous. I think it had virtually nothing to do with the laws passed in the 90s on that. None of the main players, Fannie, Freddie, Lehman, Bear, were affected by that. What you had was just a complete breakdown of any gatekeeper with any sensibility during a kind of deregulatory, a kind of non-regulatory ideology in the Bush administration, which led to rating agencies stamping AAA on the worst packages. That meant that anybody could do anything, could sell any mortgage, any subprime. And so it's important to understand this was not caused by people who were fair housing advocates, who responsibly, for years, were able to make sure people did well. It probably wasn't caused by the law there. It was caused by just a kind of complete recklessness. And the harm is so enormous, both in the harm it did to people and into how difficult it is to recover from a financial crisis, that it does show how important it is for us that we should remember that even when times are good, to prevent that from happening. When I think of two legacies that worry me from the Great Recession, one of them is the problem of long-term unemployment, which I won't go into now, but I think it's a very serious challenge. And the other is that as housing prices start to rise, more and more families go out of negative equity. So there is something self-correcting going on as the economy gets better and housing markets go up. But there are some communities where just housing prices go up will not make things better. That's what Lee and I are working on in Detroit. Where you have a degree of blight in the community, the fact that housing prices generally are going up doesn't help a particular neighborhood where you have 3 or 4 buildings that are unsafe, that might have predators in them, that make people scared to live there. And what is just absolutely insane is that if you could do nothing else, I mean, it's not the best, but if you could do nothing else but tear down those buildings and at least take the blight out, you would help a lot. It's not that you'd want to build something there, but if you just did that, the fact that in places like Detroit, we as a country can't summon up the funds to at least help them take down all of the blight there. And so if we talk about this recovery getting better, we'll talk about having a recovery, but when you talk about what's the uneven recovery, it will be the scars that are left. And one of the scars that I worry about the most is the neighborhoods that are affected by blight, which need a little bit of spending to help them get past it. And if we don't, we're making life incredibly difficult for those neighborhoods to come back. So that, and then the second issue, just on when you're talking about the tax evasion, I want to go to a point that Nick was making. I'm for corporate tax reform. I would like to see us bring down rates. I'd like to see us prevent tax evasion. I think we need to fix our system. However, what a lot of people want to do is not have a corporate tax reform. They just want to have a repatriation holiday. The repatriation holiday is just for what Nick talks about. We did it in '04. They bring the money back and they buy back stocks. They buy back their stock. The rhetoric is they're going to invest more in the United States. When in the Obama administration, we went to people who advocated and said, you know what, let's talk. If you're willing to say you're going to bring back money and go over your baseline for investment in jobs, we might let you do some repatriation holiday. Weren't even interested in the discussion. That is the key thing, and so I can't tell you how much from a policy point of view that even if you're for corporate tax reform, which I am, a repatriation holiday is not corporate tax reform. It is not a solution to get more investment in jobs back in our country. It is just a strategy to let people buy back their stock shares. It's not about jobs or investment. We know that.
Just on the second question, we could talk about boycotts or positive consumer action, which is to support companies that are doing good things. There's actually, I heard about this the other day, in Asheville, North Carolina, they couldn't get, basically the North Carolina state legislature suppressed the local city's ability to raise the minimum wage. So what they did is they got an app to actually show who was paying a higher than a livable wage and who wasn't. And it actually affected consumer behavior. So beyond a boycott, are there positive ways to reinforce companies that are going above the minimum wage, who are paying more livable wages? Gap just moved to 1010. Are there things we could do as consumers because this is a big kind of challenge?
Are you asking me a question?
I'm asking you, Nick. Is there anything we could do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways in which you can encourage good behavior, but I am, it takes one to know one, I guess. And boy, if somebody like me says that we don't need to be regulated, we're lying. I mean, there's no other way to put it. You know, you know, what I've noticed about life is that everyone wants other people held to a high standard. You know, but feels like they can do it. You know, people like me on Wall Street and other places are like, oh no, don't worry, it'll be fine. Trust us. But don't trust us, because that's just not going to work out well for you. And I'm violently in favor of significant reforms to our financial system. And you know, a very deep problem is the ability of financial institutions to take risk that benefits them, but ultimately will be socialized. If it doesn't work out, will be socialized. And Glass-Steagall was one instantiation of a solution to that problem that served us well for 50 years. I can't remember, a long time. And in the absence of that, it cannot be, but that we will have another, you know, circumstance like it again. My opinion. So.
Question right here. Just identify yourself. A mic is coming.
So if the major problem that we're facing is stagnant wages.
So Steve Silverstein. I'll identify him for everybody.
Oh, thank you. I forgot who I was. I thought it wasn't important. So if one of the main problems is stagnant wages, and one of the tools that we have is tax policy, particularly a corporate tax policy, isn't there something that we could do about incenting corporations to raise people's wages by putting some kind of subsidy in there, just like we incent corporations in the tax policy to put money abroad or have renewable energy and things like that?
So, Jean, I don't know if you could, it'd be great if you could respond. I think that the broad frustration is, you know, wages have been really stagnant in the country. There's obviously a tight labor market. Solution to that, but beyond that, is there anything we can do at the kind of with tax policy to incentivize companies to actually take on this challenge?
You know, I'm not, you know, in the American Jobs Act for kind of a stimulus purpose or increasing demand purpose, we did talk about giving a bit of payroll relief to small businesses to hire. I think it's harder to have probably an ongoing policy like that, because you know, you could just simply be subsidizing, you know, the people paying what they were going to pay anyways, and you'd want to make sure people were actually getting more. What I do think, though, it goes to the discussion I was just having on the repatriation a bit, is that I do think that you want your incentives to be directed towards things that are investment and job creating. So for example, let me speak about with corporate tax reform, for example. What you'll hear on corporate tax reform is that you're going to hear some people, very conservative, NFIB and others, say, well, if you reform corporate taxes, you have to lower individual rates for anybody who has business income, because they're pass-throughs, they're partnerships, there's S-corps. And the idea is that if you lower their rates, well, you know, that's going to be great. Well, you know, I'm right now spurling economic strategies, okay? So I promise you, you don't want to give me a tax cut. You don't. I mean, you know, I'll do fine. And I don't, you know, it's not going to affect. And that's, the goal is going to be, if you want to help small businesses, partnerships, S-corps in corporate tax reform, what you want to do is not lower the amount of taxes they take when you take money and put it into your personal bank account. You want to make it easier for people to invest in the US. So if the way you deal with that is you say, we're going to do $1 million expensing for small businesses, or you had some kind of wage incentive, or some R&D incentive, that's at least ensuring that the tax incentives you get are directed towards the actual behavior you want. The supply side view is you just give money to people who are well off and it will happen automatically. As Nick and others says, that doesn't work out. So what I do think is when we do want to incent, tie it directly to the behavior you want. If it's more R&D investment in the US, if it's more investment in the US, if it's more job hiring in the US, tie it directly to that. Don't just give it to well-off people. And I think when you face corporate tax reform, this is what you're going to hear. And my view is we don't say that we don't care about small businesses and passive partnerships. We want business tax reform to help them, but we want to help them by incenting it, making it easier for them to invest in the country, not just saying we're going to put more money in your personal account and hope that it works out.
I think we've got, do you want to say something?
Yeah, let me just say something, and I'm an organizer coming from a union background. And I think that, that we've got to think outside the box on some of the solutions that confront working families across the country. I would expect that most people in this room consider themselves to be progressive, I would think. And so we need to come up with some new progressive ideas to deal with the challenges. And maybe they might be a little different, but that's okay. But we've got to be creative enough to think outside the box. I mean, as far as growing the union movement, the labor movement in this country, Keith Ellison has a bill that obviously is not going to go anywhere in Congress, but it's out there and he's put it on the table, and that is that organizing is a civil right, okay? I mean, we should attach ourselves to that kind of legislation. We should attach ourselves, just as we should attach ourselves to other progressive issues that confront all of us. I mean, we aren't the progressive moment. I mean, we're the progressive movement, I think. And so we ought to act like a movement, and the way you do that is to organize at the grassroots level, communicate a program, talk about what that program should be, identify what the needs are of working families across the country, and then develop issues and programs around that. And we can't continue to play on their playing field. And that's what we're doing. We've got to have our own playing field. And we've got to be aggressive in developing that kind of agenda.
That's great.
Can I just tag on to that? Because I think that in my home state, and Lee and I have talked a lot about what's happened in Wisconsin in recent years, that the divide and conquer strategy has been so incredibly effective that dividing folks that have very common economic interests, political interests, but seeing themselves as estranged from one another, and looking at what we're doing in the future, not just as issues and what we're for, but movements, organizing around each movement. And then, you know, a part of that is electing the legislative leaders who will be moving that forward, but everybody's more invested when we're organizing. We have to take more from one another as we plot the future here.
I think we have time for one more question. Maybe we'll try and get a few more, but I think we have one in the back over there.
Thank you. I'm Edward Luce from the Financial Times. Everything that all of the panelists have been saying, and you, Neera, makes sense, whether it's on retirement security, medium wage stagnation, and so forth, women's pay equality. But all of this is very familiar, and that many of the solutions that you've been raising are familiar. Clearly, in the wake of the midterm results, this is almost entirely academic, at least at the federal level in Washington, D.C. This agenda doesn't stand much chance of being furthered here in Washington. So my question is, where do you, the panelists, see, and Neera, see you furthering this agenda in the next 2-3 years? Is it at the local level? Is it with direct consumer action, as you mentioned? Where is this not going to be academic, this discussion?
So I guess I would just beg to differ. I'll leave it to the panels. I'd beg to differ that, like, we've actually had we've actually discussed at the federal level how upside down the retirement savings system is, and that you could have bold new policies to actually make that more available to middle class folks. Perhaps we've done it in the past. We haven't been discussing that recently. But maybe Nick and others can talk about the effect we've had at the local level. Progressive ideas have been moving at the city and state level. Maybe Lee, you could join in on that. But Nick, do you want to start? And anyone who wants to join in.
I mean, I'm sort of with Neera in that I sort of beg to differ. I think, in my humble opinion, we did a horrible job as progressives of connecting with voters on these issues because we are too tentative and we have not advanced an alternative theory of growth, frankly, that people find compelling and and that they can identify with. And until we do, we're going to continue to get our butts kicked. But there is much to be done around the country, locally. What we did in Seattle on 15 is a great example of what can be done both for people, but more particularly to completely reframe an issue nationally. You know, coming from Seattle, Washington, I know you all here think you're the leaders of the world, but we don't really see it that way. You know, we see the United States Senate, with all due respect, as a confirmatory body, not a leadership body, and it's sort of up to us in the states and in the cities to prove what policies work, what ideas matter, and then, you know, the country will follow. And I think that, I honestly think that, you know, it's good for our democracy and our economy for people in localities like cities to advance these causes in broad ways. And then, you know, you've got, you know, our leaders here in Washington, D.C. who can come in from behind. I mean, it just seems like that's really how it works. So,
you know, I actually am a tiny bit more optimistic on one piece. I think the challenges we're talking about are so huge that I think right now the conservatives have been in a position to just be against. Yeah. I think now that you're governing and you have to put a candidate up in 2016, I think it's going to be pretty hard to simply have no solution at all that deals with kind of this middle class squeeze or these issues. I think the pressure to talk about retirement security and college opportunity, preschool even, I think it's going to be greater, and I think it will look fairly empty, I think, in 2016 to have nothing being said. So I think the pressure will emerge to at least have the conversation. I'll tell you one area where I think that gets too little attention, maybe because it's not sexy or as exciting enough, but where I think you could see progress around the country is we are a very, very weak country at connecting people who need jobs with people who need to hire people for jobs. We have a very poor system of ensuring people know exactly what skill to get and connecting them. That is something where success at local levels can become, I think, the success can be what is pointed to for more national policy. So I do think that is one of the areas. Secondly, you know, you do the best you can in policy. So, you know, we couldn't do everything we'd like, just having left the Obama administration, but one thing we did was, for example, our manufacturing innovation clusters. Now, those are they're not big enough to change the world, but as they're successful, you can see the clamoring from Republicans as well as Democrats to want them in their state and want them in their district. So my view is that you build the case. You build the case for success. That can be at the state and local level, but that can also be things that get started now that show success and then become the format or the platform to say, this is working in these 8 communities, why can't it work nationally? And that can happen through national programs that maybe pilot, even though they should be broad. It can happen state, city level. So I think you have to always be building for the moment and showing the success that when you have the moment gives you the evidence you need for something broader and expansive.
Thanks to this great panel. I'm really happy that we ended on a positive note of what can get done, because if we can't make any progress, then the Center for American Progress is really poorly named. So I want to thank my panelists, the panelists for this great discussion and really driving towards ideas from overtime to retirement security to wage challenges very directly, organizing, et cetera. And I asked Tammy Baldwin about women's economic security. It is a big focus for us at CAP, and we are always trying to make the connection between women's economic security and economic growth and how women are experiencing and families are experiencing these issues in their everyday lives. So I thank the panel, and I'm going to ask you all to turn your attention to another fantastic